Good evening, everyone. Welcome to week 12 of HIE 101, the Anthropocene, Humans and Their Environment. It's been the goal of this course, I think from the beginning, to always to give you a sense of your present world from a long historical lens. And we've chosen to do that not chronologically, but thematically. And certainly the events of the last week or two, or we could even look at the last year or so or beyond, highlight that the topic that we're going to cover this week, the environment, is probably the biggest issue facing the current world, your generation, and even mine. Certainly, the events that have been going on in British Columbia this week have brought those into sharp relief for many Canadians, as we try to grapple with how do we deal with and how do we adapt to what is coming our way in terms of climate change. So this week's readings, one by J.R. McNeill, out of his book, the opening chapter out of his book, Something New Under the Sun, which really examines the transformations that happen to the environment over the course of the 20th century. And then the second one, also by McNeill, but also that involves a few other authors, that deals with this large concept. And that's been another thing that the course has tried to deal with, is to try to give you broad concepts that have driven history. Again, we go back to the first week, the kind of big history, the longue durée, and these big ideas that I think will give you a sense of, not only for those of you who are interested in history, but for all of you who are who plan to go on to do a business or economics or political science or military and strategic studies or even English or others. So these large concepts, and the Anthropocene is one that reading, perhaps it's a little bit technical, but I think it deals with this whole idea that are we entering a very new age? One that perhaps unlike any other is being driven by a sole species, and that sole species are human beings. Okay, so I'm going to start then by looking at the news, and this is not meant in many ways to kind of doom scroll through the news. I know that climate anxiety and climate change anxiety is a real thing, so this is not meant to trigger in any way, shape, or form. But, like I said, the events of the last week or more have put into stark relief the kinds of challenges that we, as various societies across the earth, face over the next few decades, and sort of a sense of how we got here, and both in terms of, are there lessons from history that we can learn, or at least get a sense of the context that, perhaps we are not the only people to have been in this position before. What has worked, what has not, and kind of how the whole, in some ways, we're going to finish off on how the environmental movement, particularly over the last 4 to 5 decades, but I think you could probably go back a little bit longer than that, has tried to grapple with many of these questions and issues. So we'll start with COP26, right? It was in the news from Glasgow, meeting a couple of weeks ago, meeting of world leaders, including our own Justin Trudeau, who arrived in Glasgow to try and institute limits to fossil fuel production and to the production of CO2 that will get released into the atmosphere, right? And you can see from the picture here, right, this whole idea of a climate emergency, right, to act on previous UN and other global accords to try and limit CO2 production into the atmosphere, and to try and sort of stem the tide, if not hopefully turn it back in terms of global climate change. And so many have looked at this as our kind of perhaps a turning point, right? That if we only have so many chances to get it right, and this may be our last one. And again, like I said, much of this has come home to roost in Canada, particularly over the last 6 to 12 months. Those of you who are from out west, particularly from British Columbia, would have experienced the heat dome that hovered over much of the Northwest, including Washington State and California and that, but also the lower BC mainland, that sent temperatures to new record highs well into the 40s, never seen before. And then within days of that, and this is only into June, just basically into summer, the ways in which, as it was, if it wasn't bad enough, that the heat caused heat exhaustion and exacerbated health problems associated that might be made worse by the heat. Fires hit, consuming entire towns, such as Lytton, BC, that you can see here in this picture, within minutes. Now, this wasn't necessarily BC's worst fire season, but it certainly was up there, and we certainly have seen the ways in which fire, not just in Canada, but the Western United States, but also in the Southern Hemisphere as well, places like Australia over the last while, has had an impact on populations and on pushing forward this idea of a climate emergency. So third most active fire season in British Columbia history, but maybe what's probably more important is that that fires were still burning. Fire seasons is starting earlier and ending later. So these are going to be real challenges as we move forward. And then, of course, the tragic events of this week that are actually still going on, the tremendous rain and floods that have basically washed away a good chunk of or put underwater a good chunk of the lower mainland of British Columbia, cutting off the port of Vancouver, but many communities almost from the rest of Canada. In that sense, the destruction, as you can see here, of the Trans-Canada Highway, but also the terrible flooding that has gone on and the destruction to wildlife, to agriculture, to dairy cattle, chickens, you name it, in the Abbotsford area. And certainly in the aftermath of these terrible storms and the flooding, many have pointed to the fact that, essentially the fires of the summer created conditions whereby mudslides and other things would occur, right? There's no anchors of trees to hold the soil in place, but it also changes the chemistry of the soil, which makes it less able to soak up any kind of water that may come its way. Now, others have also pointed to the fact that the Fraser River Valley has flooded before, and particularly when you build on a floodplain, as you can see here, much of what is underwater in the Abbotsford area used to actually be a lake until the 1920s, until it was drained because it was a nuisance to local farmers. When the Fraser Valley river did overflow and obviously drain into the lake, and then the lake would in some ways flood as well. So the best thing they thought they could do was to drain the lake. Wonderful, great farmland. Anything that exists on an alluvial plain like this, as we know, this has always been the centers of human settlement and human agriculture, because again, these are the floodplains provide great rich soil, and as you can see here, right, for centuries this was a lake. And so again, human impacts, human environments that have been created, some may claim artificially created, but these are the challenges that we face moving forward, right? We have to go with what we have, right? But again, certainly Canada was not the only one. We saw tremendous floods through Germany, the very, very active hurricane season, in which some of the worst effects of some of the largest storms, Hurricane Ida, which was the largest storm to hit Louisiana and the mainland United States since Hurricane Katrina. And many of you probably, if you don't remember it, certainly heard of the tremendous destruction that it did to New Orleans. Much of the city has not recovered. Much of the population that was forced to move away in the aftermath of the flood have not moved back. But it didn't hit Louisiana the hardest. It hit New York, the New York State area, New York, New Jersey, creating flash floods, flooding the creating dramatic footage of flooding the New York City subway system, but also drowning people in their own cars and in their own homes. And much of this was known that could potentially occur, but there wasn't anything that could be done in many ways to stop it. And the same thing might be said about BC. But other pictures, again, from the last summer, right? That those looking to the southwest, the dramatic pictures here of Lake Mead, a reservoir created by the huge Hoover Dam, which basically created a huge irrigation and power system that enabled much of the southwest of the United States to be populated, to make the desert grow, right, so that we can get our strawberries, our broccoli, and all the other things that go on our tables. And this was created in the 1930s in many ways to kind of modernize American society in the midst of the Great Depression, to dam up the mighty Colorado River, which one of the main river systems in the American West, not just for the Americans, but also for Mexico. And 40 million people now depend upon that river for their lives, both their jobs, water, electricity, you name it. And this is 15 million more than in 1992. So the tremendous growth of what we might call the Sun Belt states was created by the manipulation of nature, which is now potentially coming back to haunt the area. And as you can see here, most of that water goes to agriculture. Hydroelectricity is sold to everywhere from California to Wyoming. These have wide-ranging effects. But the lake is losing 10% of its water, its capacity, every year, simply due to evaporation. And as temperatures rise, we know that evaporation will only increase, and therefore that even threatens hydro production. So these are, again, we think about California and the move towards green vehicles and electric vehicles, and those are going to be the saviors. But if there's no electricity to power them because the dams don't have enough water moving through them, then where is that going to come from? Others of you who are perhaps feeding yourselves and other things like that may have noticed the prices at the grocery store. This has become, again, another big news issue in the last month or so, right in the midst of a global pandemic, in which we know there's been mass layoffs, there's been all kinds of other things that you would think that, inflation would be kept low. Now, we know that there are quote unquote supply chain issues. Some of those are actually caused by environmental concerns, and certainly we'll see that in the aftermath of the floods in BC. But these are rates of inflation that have not been seen since the 1970s. And again, rising oil prices, we want to name a number of different things, but also due to climate change, increasing temperatures across the Canadian West and elsewhere, declining groundwater availability, which again, used for other purposes such as the tar sands and other sort of mega projects, but also other forms of agriculture, and hot weather, and that increases the evaporation and the draining of large aquifers. And many others as well. This is also causing, even when irrigation is used, even when you use those dams, right, to pent up water and to distribute it nicely and evenly, right? Because again, we know that it's not always total rainfall or total sunshine, it's right, or total heat. It's when it comes and when it doesn't. And farmers know this, that right, rain at particular times or too much heat at particular times can ruin their crops, even if over the year it's kind of quote unquote normal. But it's also causing things like the growing salinity of soils, which brings salt to the surface and which makes the soil less and less productive, which means more and more use of fertilizers, a whole range of other things, which again depend highly upon fossil fuels and depend on hydroelectric power to power the plants to create that nitrogen fixing process. And again, some of these issues, we go back to week one, feeding the world, the green revolution, all of those other kinds of things are based on particular climatic conditions, and they're based on a whole range of factors that are all interlinked, much in the same way that we might think of as an ecosystem as all interlinked. We cannot isolate one element Okay. So in all of this as well, right, the growing desertification, right, that we know that's occurring across, across places like Australia, but also North America, but increasingly in Africa, right? But who'd have thought we'd have a shortage of sand? And that sand, right, is one of the most heavily mined resources in the world. And again, when we think about this, the phones you carry in your pocket, the computers that we're using now to carry out Zoom, all depend upon sand. They depend for their silicon chips. The houses that you live in, the concrete, the glass, all of those other kinds of things depends upon sand. And enough is mined every year to cover the island, the entire island of Great Britain. And it's even becoming a focus of gangs and organized crime who basically line up trucks and diggers and all kinds of other things you can see here on the beaches in many nations of the global south, and basically take away much of their sand or dredge river beds and deltas and all kinds of other things, which again have a tremendous impact upon the wildlife and the means of subsistence of many people and many other organisms. Okay. And again, we're going to think about the desert, right? In the last week, who'd have thought the scorpion apocalypse, torrential rains in Egypt, forcing the deadly scorpions and snakes and all kinds of other things out of their hidey holes and into some populated areas of Egypt and causing sort of mass chaos and hospitalizations. So again, 2021 is probably not finished with this yet. Okay, so what we're gonna emphasize here. So there's a few key ideas that I think are central to all of this. And again, some of this is about science and some of this is about history, but we want to think about how some of these ideas develop. And although we wouldn't think of Darwin as an environmentalist in that sense. And again, much of, I think, what other weeks have shown, right, Dr. Oliveira on these ideas of race, but also science last week that Dr. McKercher talked to us about, the science of race, the ideas of survival of the fittest, natural selection, all those other kinds of things that passed as science was in many ways pseudoscience. But Darwin really, his ideas about natural selection really emphasized, in particular his work in the Galapagos Islands, right, that these were complex ecosystems, right? That much of the life on the planet was intimately linked to specific environments, and that there was significant interplay between them, right? The difference between finches on one island or iguanas on one island and on another, right? We would think of them as kind of the same ecosystem. And he's saying, no, these are very highly attuned to one another. They're very highly specific, right? And of course, the ability of organisms to adapt to those environments, right, so that they can survive and thrive, right, can easily be thrown off by changes to those environments. So it got us to think about how all of these things are kind of interrelated. If we want to do the Lion King thing, right, the whole circle of life, right. And that not long after that, right, we came up with the ideas around ecology and the biosphere and ideas of ecosystems that became much more important and really became kind of the sort of key lingo that scientists and others would use, right? But you can see the ways in which they develop over the late 19th century and into the 20th century. And some of this has been adapted and readapted over the years, right? The Gaia theory, certainly in the 1970s, thinking about the Earth, and we'll talk more about this later in the lecture, right? This idea of this kind of spaceship Earth, right? But the Earth itself could be thought of as a kind of a super organism in which all things living and non-living act in a kind of very symbiotic and self-regulating capacity, right? And that humans should be very careful about messing with that system, particularly, right? Once we discovered that in some ways, our lonely planet was really all that we had. And so a lot of this triggers then the environmentalist movement that really grows certainly from the 1950s onward, but I think you could take it back to the kind of conservation and preservationist movements of the 19th century, and again linked to the growing industrial revolution, which in many ways was transforming nature, destroying nature, removing people from very naturalized settings, right? But even the notions of what we think of as nature or wilderness very much have changed over the years in that sense. And we're going to deal with some of those ideas. Certainly the key one today, and it's certainly a controversial one, the idea of kind of climate change, right? Previous decades, we sometimes talk about this as global warming, right? And then you hear, right, you know, that well, it's cold this week. Well, okay, whatever happened to global warming? But climate change, because this is going to have a differential impact across the globe. And we know that, you know, sometimes when it's very warm here in Canada, it's going to be very cold somewhere else. So, but how is this all going to sort of even out? But certainly, I think the scientists have shown over the last decade or more, right, that some of the warmest years on record have been within the last 20 to 30 years. And then, like I said, that final concept of the Anthropocene, right? This idea of a kind of geological, long time kind of time span that geologists and others have looked at it as sort of the development of the Earth from the Big Bang onward and through the dinosaurs and the ice ages and all of those other kinds of things. Might there be a new modern period which is defined largely by human activity and the ways in which human activity is affecting the very nature of those kind of geologic, atmospheric ecosystems that exist today, not just for human beings, but for all life on the planet, below the seas, in the air, on the land. Okay, all right. Of course, there is no real sort of perhaps golden age, right, where humans live in perfect harmony with their environments, right? That you know, ever since human beings or any other organism came in, they tried to adapt its environment to enable it to survive as much as possible. The use of fire, the creation of agriculture, all of these other kinds of things, hunting, the development of tools, right? So there was never kind of a period in which, you know, and sometimes we see this sometimes with the discussion of indigenous peoples and others, right, that these were the sort of the first environmentalists, the ones who really cared for the earth because they lived off the earth, they understood the earth, they didn't see themselves as being separate from the earth. Those things are certainly valid here to a certain degree, right? Certain peoples, certainly the Christian worldview, like views it as kind of dominion over nature rather than living within nature. But certainly, and certainly that becomes that notion in many ways of what Dr. McKercher talked about was last week in terms of Baconian science, like learning how the world works so that you can manipulate it right to your advantage. But you know, like I said, everyone is out in some ways to survive, to thrive, to pass on their genes and the rest of that to future generations. And so basically human beings have always been trying to adapt their environment to enable themselves to survive. And certainly one of the first elements of that, and that people have gone back, and I think it's mentioned very briefly in the readings, right, is that idea of the first kind of large extinction period caused by human beings, and that is the hunting down of what was termed sort of megafauna, if we want to think in North American terms, the great mastodons and woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and all the rest of that. But similarly, you know, in the rest of the world, in Africa, Asia, and Australia. And basically, you know, archaeologists and others have gone back and basically said, you know, wherever humans went in this period, mass extinctions occurred. Now, there's some debate over whether or not there were also climatic issues going on and a whole range of other things, but you know, but certainly human beings played a role in the extinction of numerous species well before the modern period. The other one here as well, I think, is what's sometimes called the Neolithic revolution, or the development of agriculture. And again, we have taken this as something that kind of signifies civilization, modernization, right? And this is, we saw this in the ways in which this has been used against indigenous peoples, colonialized peoples, right? That essentially sedentary agriculture is the way of the future, the way of modernization, and certainly, this is, certainly, again, if we look back in history in the creation of, certainly in the Fertile Crescent here, where much of this was supposed to have begun, right? The ancient cities of Babylon and Mesopotamian cultures that developed, aqueducts and, great monuments and shrines and cities and libraries and all of those other kinds of things that we associate with quote unquote civilization. And again, if we look around the globe, in the sort of in the Americas, the Aztecs, the Incas, but also the Chinese in Asia, or again, some of the things that we talked about, so West African societies in those early weeks as well, right? Same kind of thing. This was built on agriculture, but some have looked back and said maybe this is humans' original sin, right? Because what it then created then was a necessity for things like irrigation, to bring people then together in very close contact with one another, to create, which is in many ways, as we know, creates kind of power imbalances at a sort of a social level. But the use of monocrop agriculture, right? Certainly in the Fertile Crescent with things like wheat, in the Americas with things like corn. But like I said, irrigation often brings salinization of soils to create land to grow crops and to raise animals. Forests have to be cut down and burned, which then destroys natural habitats for other animals. So, and then creates things like soil erosion and soil exhaustion. So certainly agriculture may be one of those ones, again, by the ways in which, again, human beings fundamentally changed the world around them. Now, certainly in these early periods, I think as many of the authors from this experience note, that there weren't really enough of us to really have kind of global effects, but we certainly did have local effects. And many of these kind of civilizations, as we'll see, kind of rose and fall because, maybe coming back to some of those ideas that we brought up in the first couple of weeks, those kind of quote unquote Malthusian limits, right? Where population essentially outstripped resources, or certainly got to a maximal point at which depended on everything going right all the time, right? And so climactic events, other events, wars, other things like that could essentially, right, disrupt these societies and lead to their collapse. Okay, so we know though throughout history, right, and again, people who perhaps deny climate change, but also think people who support climate change, yes, recognize that climate has changed over history, and sometimes due to a whole range of things that we're not always cognizant of, and we don't always necessarily know the mechanisms. But things like volcanic activity and things like that can have an impact by throwing ash into and other elements into the atmosphere, which can block sunlight and all kinds of other things. And so people have looked at a number of periods throughout history in which the climate has significantly changed, or significantly changed in areas that have affected populations or civilizations that have been powerful or large. And certainly one of those was known as the medieval warm period. Now, people point out that, again, much like, like I said, it can be cold in Canada and warm somewhere else, right? We'll talk about things like El Niños and things like that. But essentially, right, that it certainly had an impact, on a more sort of global scale. And then we'll talk a little bit as well about what was termed the Little Ice Age, in which global temperatures actually fell over this period, and in some cases quite dramatically so, as you can see there in 1816 was deemed the year without summer because of the eruption of Indonesian volcano in the island of Tambora. But we can even go back to 1991, Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, one of the coldest years on record. Over that period, again, causes all kinds of things like droughts elsewhere on the across the earth. So, okay. So again, we think about this kind of, dark ages in the medieval period. We often think of this as something that, again, as a counterpose to the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and all of those other kinds of things. But there's significant evidence that the world grew in many important ways, not just in places like Europe, but Africa, the Middle East, Islam. Again, the importance, I think, that Dr. McKercher highlighted last week in terms of science and technology coming from outside of Europe and influencing a lot of the things that we might think of as Western science. But there's significant evidence that the Earth was in a period of a fairly warm spell, right? And that it enabled agriculture and settlements to grow over this period, particularly in Europe, particularly the north, moving into places like Germany, which were, again, when we think about, if you've been to Germany, particularly at this time of year, right, cold and wet, or even England, again, cold and wet. Enabling those societies to grow, to feed more people, to do all kinds of other things, but also significant improvements in agricultural technology, metallurgy, the development of compasses and clocks in China, cannon, gunpowder, printing presses, right? And again, what's the relationship between the prosperity of a society and its ability to produce these kinds of technological and scientific advancements, or to the chicken and egg argument, right? There's a scientific and technological advances enable those societies to grow, or what's, again, maybe those kind of symbiotic relationships, right? And in some areas of Northern Europe, we know it allowed societies such as the Norse, Norway and that area, to explore the Northern Atlantic, to actually settle places like Iceland, Greenland, which had, again, which was, as we're moving into a period where we're worried about, the Greenland glaciers and ice caps and all kinds of other things melting, in areas of Greenland over this period were able to be farmed. And it enabled then the Norse to move across the North Atlantic to Israel, where we know what showed up in the news not long ago, right? This idea that, yes, the Norse were here in places like Lauso Meadows and Newfoundland, and Labrador, what the Norse sagas would have called Vinland, and settled for a number of years. But the question then becomes is, well, then where were they when the rest of Europeans arrived, right? What happened to them? So part of this is about, again, what ends up happening with this kind of little ice age and the end of what's often known as the medieval warm period. And again, population had grown quite large in this period. Again, all of those things that we've talked about, deforestation, we're cutting down trees to transform that land into farms and things like that. Again, the use of trees before the 20th century, before the 19th century, were really the main source, the main strategic resource, right? You need it to build homes, you need it to build ships, you need it for a whole range of things, but you need it primarily as fuel, right? And so again, the burning, all of those other kinds of things. But obviously, the loss of forest habitat meant a loss of species. And we see in this period, people have gone back and said, things like the brown bear disappears from Europe, European bison, elk, all of those other kinds of things, which are either gone or certainly in such low numbers that they're all but gone. But even small rodents and other things like that, when we think about Canada's history, right, founded on the fur trade. Well, why? Well, because natural habitats and hunting and things like that had basically eradicated the stable supply of things like beaver fur for beaver hats in Europe, necessitating other sources that were necessary. Conflicts over forests get tied into some of those myths around people like Robin Hood and Sherwood Forest, because again, as those forests disappear, power relationships between kings and nobles and things like that, about setting them aside as game reserves and exclusive use for the king, for the king's navy, for the king's army, all of those other kinds of things. But those were often areas where people could supplement their diets through through hunting and things like that. So again, we think of these societies as solely agricultural, but they weren't always. And in fact, if we go back to talking about those kind of agricultural societies or Neolithic societies, again, archaeologists and others have gone back and looked at this and said, you know, this is supposed to be a hallmark of civilization, but in terms of health, agricultural societies were generally less healthy than their hunter-gatherer predecessors. And this has been shown true even among indigenous populations of North America. The Plains Cree in particular were some of the tallest people in the world in the 17th and 18th century, not, you know, towering over the Europeans who they would eventually come to meet. But all of this then is this, you know, creates a situation in which, you know, we're at a maximal area, right, in terms of population, in terms of deforestation. And people pointed out, right, that Europe's forests of today are about the same size as Europe's forests of 1300. So it gives you the sense of you know, how much forest had kind of disappeared. And then, right, cold hits, right? Cold, and you can see here from rain and all sorts of weather, which then leads to crop failures, right? Because crops either can't go in the ground, or they rot in the ground, or they don't grow enough. It leads then to famines that start to, maybe people have gone back and looked at the medieval warm period and said, most of these societies are without famine. Until around the 13th century, 14th century. And then it starts to hit with regular you know, occurrences. It causes, again, or certainly is exacerbated then by political, social, economic tensions, the 30 Years' War, the War of the Roses in Britain. And then, of course, we know that the Black Death hits, right? And again, the bubonic plague, as we know, begins in China and moves westward over the first half of the 14th century. Eventually, by the 1340s, starts to infect areas of Europe. Now, China had experienced similar kinds of, perhaps even more dramatic population declines over this period, as some of these figures show. But certainly in a very short space in time, between 1347 and 1360, more than a quarter of the European population dies. And in some cases, Europe kind of rewilds, forests start to grow back, all of those other kinds of things as humans started to kind of disappear from the landscape. But we know it certainly for quote unquote Mother Earth, right? It was only a brief reprieve. Global population, China, Europe, largely rebounds by 1500. But again, if we want to think about, you know, the impacts of famines, and we talked about this perhaps earlier in the course as well, is that this is not always simply about lack of food. Like we know in the more modern period, and we can talk more about this, right, is the ways in which these are political events, more so than anything else. It's about the distribution of food, not necessarily the availability of food, but poor nourishment, malnutrition. Does that make, and we know that this makes populations far more susceptible to disease. Disease then makes it far more difficult for farmers to do things like plant crops and tend to their animals. So this again has these kind of symbiotic kind of interrelationships, right? That we need to kind of understand. And again, these are not the only places where kind of societies tend to collapse, right? And some of them collapse, you know, quite dramatically. So as we know, Europe and China rebound, but the Maya, you know, in between 350 and 850 grows by leaps and bounds, and then after 850 kind of seems to disappear. The Anasazi of that area of the Southwest United States, the Pueblo people who create, again, a tremendously large society based again on irrigation, agriculture, and the development of aqueducts and all kinds of other things between 600 and 1150. And then all of a sudden they kind of disappear. The Norse, right? Again, disappear. Mississippian cultures place in central United States. The mound building cultures that if you travel to places like St. Louis, you can see these huge ceremonial mounds and evidence that of large concentrated populations, we maybe even call cities, right? Cahokia in near present day St. Louis, which is the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, is bigger than London. in this period, bigger than London, Europe, so, or London, England. So what do these all have kind of in common, right? Again, these tremendous growth. And then, right, they reach kind of maximal capacity, and things like deforestation, intensive monocrop agriculture, the loss of biodiversity, all of those other kinds of things have, they start to reach the limits, right? The limit, and we've talked about this earlier, and of course, the limits to growth, right? And again, the resulting population declines due to famine, due to disease, which often go together, and again, social and political conflict that kind of develops around many of these things. And so again, we started our course, right, with someone like Jared Diamond, again, talking about, guns, germs, and steel, and why, particular societies rose to power. Well, he followed this with another kind of one of these big think books. Now, again, some of these ideas, like I said, have been challenged in their details by historians and by others, but basically, what happened to some of these societies that collapsed, and why in some other instances where societies face similar pressures did they not collapse? Okay. One other element, and again, sometimes you may have heard of this before, the El Nino systems and all the rest of these kinds of things, as we know in North America, are responsible for things like, like the Pineapple Express that dumps so much water on the Northwest, or what make certain parts of Canada warm in the winter and other parts cold, right? And so historians, archaeologists, a whole range of other climate scientists have been able to go back and kind of piece together through diary accounts, through records largely created by imperial regimes in places like India and elsewhere, in the Southern Hemisphere, but also things like sediment deposits and pollen counts and tree ring counts, all of those other kinds of things, the more sort of scientific side, and plotted back in history a number of these kinds of events that we've mostly known about in the 20th century, but obviously existed for a long time before that, right? And so some of them have traced it back to things like certain El Nino events in the late 1780s that caused crop failures, that caused climactic events that would have an influence on things that we think about in terms of, well, it's just a political event, right? The French Revolution. It was caused by the fact that the king wanted to raise taxes, had to call the three estates back together to get their consent to do so, and essentially many of those three estates and essentially the peasants decided that no way, Jose, it's not going to happen, and we're gonna get rid of you and institute a new regime. But a lot of this had to do with the anger that came out of this and that kind of preceded it was due in many ways to difficult economic times, to climactic events that caused economic stressors, which led to these kinds of events. Others have pointed out, Mike Davis here, that again we read in the first week on urban slums, has looked at again what he calls late Victorian Holocaust, huge El Nino events that had, as you can see here, a devastating effect on India, China, Brazil, and elsewhere. And again, noting, as modern economists note, that it wasn't because Indians lacked food. In many cases, they were still exporting food, but they were also then growing more things like cotton, right? If we go back to Beckert, we talk about the ways in which India replaced the United States as a stable supplier for Britain. Textile mills, cotton manufacturers, right? They were growing cotton instead of growing food, and they were shipping that to the center. And again, the ways in which British officials basically thought of this as a way to discipline colonial populations, to basically say, well, you need to learn how to work harder. You need to get with the new a system of the invisible hand of the market, and we're not going to intervene. Now, again, this was not just used against what we might call racialized populations. The same arguments were being used in the 1840s during the Irish potato famine. Although, again, as we note, race shifts over the years, and in some cases, the Irish were racialized by their English and British counterparts. We've talked about this in earlier weeks as well, how, sort of, if we're going to look at kind of accelerating events, then the arrival, obviously, of Europeans and others with Columbus in 1492, and what, again, we talked about in earlier weeks, the kind of Columbian exchange that occurs afterwards, right? This discovery is not just a discovery of new worlds, it's a transformation of them. And it's not just a human demographic takeover, which we think about as kind of European populations kind of replacing indigenous ones, settler colonialism. But the settler colonialism that comes with it is not just that, it's plants. It's wheat that takes over, native grasses. It's the emergence of cows and pigs and horses that replace bison and other things, and rats, and as we know, again, diseases and all kind of microbes and all kinds of other things. Now, again, as we noted, some of this stuff is not necessarily intended, right? It's the unintended consequences of history that Dr. McCurchan noted last week, but it certainly has an unequal effect. That exchange, even though things went the other way, right, was largely unequal. And certainly it was indigenous populations and the ways in which North America has very much been transformed by Europe and elsewhere that we get this kind of almost like, a global sense of Europe, right? These neo-Europes, sometimes historians and others refer to them. But we also want to think about the Great Dying, in which modern scientists, not going back and looking at this, have actually sort of said that the loss of so much life among indigenous populations actually led to the lowering of global CO2 levels, because of the fact that places were being reforested or rewilding, and as well fewer and fewer people doing things to put CO2 into the atmosphere. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in the next few slides. All of this is really laid out, I think, in the readings by McNeill and others. But we noted this from the first week, right? That really is what we can think about, over the last 250 years, the ways in which, this kind of economic everything take off, right? Again, that kind of stable, almost zero growth until the 1780s, 1790s, and then in the 1800s, and particularly in the 20th century, the way population, again, global economic production, what McNeill will talk about and the authors talk about as the energy bottleneck is broken, right? With the use of coal, and the later other fossil fuels such as oil, natural gas, and then the creation and development of things like electricity. And so this great acceleration that occurs primarily after 1750, but again, which McNeill and others will point out, right, really increases in the post-1950 period. And maybe it would have come earlier, as they note, if there had not been wars and other things to interrupt some of that. And here some of these graphs show maybe not causation, but certainly strong correlation between the ways in which we've created this globalized economy and the ways in which the global environment, right, the entire ecosphere of the earth has been transformed particularly by human activity, by one species in particular. Now, again, like I said before, some of this also created, I don't know what you want to call it, a backlash, but certainly created a response. And in the 19th century, if we want to think about the kind of early, maybe environmentalist kind of movement, it starts with, the kind of romantic movement, Wordsworth and others looking out upon the kind of disappearing English countryside, or the interruption of that countryside by coal mining and railroads, churning out black smoke and all those other kinds of things. Now, for a good chunk of the 19th and 20th century, right, that kind of black smoke was signs of progress, right? And there were even those in the Romantic movement, right, that talked about, the fact that this was this was glorious, right? Because human beings, civilization was advancing and progressing, and all of those other kinds of things. But increasingly, ideas around wilderness, and you see this particularly in the Germanic elements of Romanticism, but elsewhere as well, even into the United States and the sort of Anglosphere as well, was not something that needed to be transformed or overcome, but valued and treasured. And again, in large part because it was disappearing, it was under threat. And so early environmental activism was largely geared towards creating wildlife preserves and reserves. And so we'll see in a few minutes, national park system is created in the United States in 1872. There was actually other national parks in places like Trinidad and Tobago and in the global South. So, these claims by the Americans that, they're the first is not necessarily true, but kind of, as we know, power and population and all of those other kinds of things enabled them to kind of claim these sorts of things. But Canada, again, Banff National Park, Sulphur Springs is created by Sir John A. Macdonald as the kind of first kind of national park or area for Canadians. But again, early parks were still also coterminous with things like forest protection. And there's a tweet I found a few weeks ago that forest and forest protection and forest conservancy was one of the first elements of government and state intervention into the economy, because again, timber was so important for a whole range of things, from fuel to building construction to, again, as you can see here, things like navies. And we understand that Canada became part and parcel of kind of the supply line for the British Navy, certainly during the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century. But as you can see here, right, it took a long time for some of those forests to be able to regenerate, to actually have an impact, and in some cases were, far too late in the case of the Danes, right? That their 90,000 oak trees were only ready in 2007. So again, all these kinds of notions of kind of forestry services and park systems and all the rest of that. And so much of this was still tied to the dictates of the capitalist economy, right? Because of this idea that we needed resources for tomorrow. We had to kind of shepherd them, steward them, right, and be able to kind of protect them. But again, thinking about their value in a very economic sense, rather than necessarily in the kind of their intrinsic sense. And again, many of the early preservationist organizations were often run in the interests of hunters, sport fishers, all kinds of other things. We think of groups like Ducks Unlimited, and great work that it does in terms of protecting wetlands and all kinds of other things, which for the longest period of time were like, oh, just drain the wetland, as we saw with what happens in the Fraser Valley, right? What happens when you drain a wetland. But again, long history going back to the creation of game reserves in England. Okay, and so really, what we start to see over the course of the 20th century is this increasing rise of environmental activism as the kind of wilderness and the kind of nature tends to recede into the background, but also in which it becomes quite evident, and we talked about this in the first couple of weeks of the course with a whole range of issues around cities, that we know that cities and factory life had a tremendously debilitating effect on the health of their populations, crowd diseases, pollution, all of those other kinds of things. And so, again, in the name of progress and civilization, right, what were the costs? And so people start thinking about the costs, but also thinking about, can we continue on this? Can we continue on this path? And one of those, I think that often kicks this off is the Sierra Club and John Muir, a Scottish immigrant to the United States, who's a botanist, zoologist, essentially the father of the modern US environmental movement, who very much fundamentally transformed the ways that Americans viewed wilderness, right? Because again, wilderness in an American sense, right? The Puritans and the Pilgrims had come to transform the howling wilderness, right, into a new civilization that would be a city on the hill, that would be worthy of God's eyes, and that would be the beacon of light and freedom and progress for every other civilization on Earth. And so this idea of wilderness really starts to take hold, that, this idea of kind of leaving things as they are, pristine, allowing things to just kind of exist not for the benefit of humankind, but just for their own benefit. And certainly Muir was one of these early ones, this kind of in some of these more intrinsic versions or ideas of nature. And he's one of the, again, prime movers towards the creation of the national park system, the creation of Yosemite National Park in California. But one of the things that kind of drives this is the flooding of an area just near the park. It's the park known as the Hetchy Hetch Valley. And San Francisco needed water to run its for hydroelectric power, but also again in the aftermath of the Great Fire, to be able to put out fires, to be able to support its population with clean, fresh drinking water. In fact, the water from the valley from this aquifer, this aqueduct system, is still so pure that San Francisco is one of the few remaining cities not to have to purify and treat its water. But it's going to flood, as you can see here, that huge area of what was known as the Hetchy Hetch Valley. And Muir opposed this. Now he has, you can see him here, was standing right next to Teddy Roosevelt. He moved among the high flyers in American society. Gifford Pinchot, the director of the U.S. Forestry Service, who again was an early ally and things like that. But Roosevelt and Pinchot and others, couldn't understand this idea of just leaving things alone, right? We could have both, right? We could have this wonderful nature in Yosemite National Park, but we also could have the benefits that would accrue to civilization from damming up the valley, creating these huge irrigation and hydroelectric electric power projects. And in 1914, Muir's allies basically go against him and allow Congress to create the Hetchy Hetch Dam. And again, we think about all of the other kinds of dam systems that, again, Dr. McKercher talked about in this last system, the Three Gorges Dam in China, or the Aswan Dam, which becomes a central focus of the Cold War, and the Suez Crisis in 1956 in Egypt, but which has had tremendous impacts on the Nile Delta and the Egyptian economy in a whole range of other ways as well. So this is not just limited to these kinds of one-off kind of things. Okay, others come along. People like Aldo Leopold, who develops this idea around the land ethic, and he begins as a prominent, again, forester and wilderness advocate. So it comes out of this kind of forestry kind of background. And he becomes the manager of the Carson National Forest in New Mexico. But he's one of the first to actually create and develop the United States' first kind of wilderness area, the Gila National Forest, in 1924. Eventually, he moves his family back during the Depression to Wisconsin, where he tries to take over a farm and kind of return it, what he said, kind of return it to its natural habitat. But again, what's natural, what's not, right? We can have some of these discussions. He's a prolific author, although this first book is actually only produced posthumously. But again, in lots of magazines and all kinds of things. But this idea that community needed to be more than just people, right? It needed to be the land and all living things in it, right? This conservation is the state of harmony between men and land, although you can see here that for someone who we think about as being concerned with the environment and natural habitat and purity and all of those other kinds of things, maybe the pipe wasn't so good for him. Okay. Others that we think about in this period, the baby tooth survey of the 1950s that comes out of the development of the nuclear bomb. So, obviously, again, that kind of huge transformative event, both politically, but also kind of environmentally. And during the 1950s, as the two superpowers try to develop more complex and dependable weapon systems, right, they test a lot of that in the atmosphere. And where does that radiation go? Well, some mothers are concerned that it has started to appear in their breast milk and now in their baby's teeth. And so there was a movement in the 1950s to to have people send in their babies' teeth to test for the presence of strontium-90. And so again, when we think about the kind of environmentalist movement, we often think about it, in terms of kind of white middle class, and some of this is evident here, but it's also women as well. So it's paying attention to the kind of gendered and gender notions that are going on here and the development. Women have always been central in many ways to the environmental movement, even if they don't always show up kind of on the front lines, although we could think about the young Dutch girl. Anyway, I can't remember her name, but it'll come back to me and someone will remind me of it in our discussions. So again, these kinds of things. And again, the anti-nuclear, and it gets tied into not just the kind of ban the bomb, so anti-war, but also this idea of environmentalism. The other one, and again, significant here in terms of women involvement, is the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, who is a popular sort of a marine biologist, works for the U.S. Fishery and Wildlife Service, publishes a lot of her work. She wins national book awards for some of her books about marine biology. She's kind of, someone has claimed that, she was kind of the Jacques Cousteau before there was Jacques Cousteau, but publishes widely in places like the Atlantic magazine and New Yorker and all the rest of that. And she became increasingly concerned over the 1950s with the widespread use of chemical pesticides and the way in which they remained in the water and affected the water environment she was studying. And her chief target was something known as DDT, which had been developed during World War II and was used in the aftermath as kind of a developmental project largely for third world nations to battle malaria. Wouldn't this be great to eradicate malaria? That it would get rid of a chief sickness, a thing that kills millions, still kills millions of people every year across the globe. And again, not just even related to Africa and Asia, but also North America and elsewhere. But so DDT becomes known as this kind of bug bomb, right? Because it's going to transform this, but it's also a bomb in which, like the nuclear bomb, right, obliterates all in its path. And Carson's work, I mean, she was very much seen as kind of anti-pesticide, anti-spraying, anti all of these other kinds of things. And she said, no, we can do this. We can eradicate. We should use it, but we can't use it indiscriminately. We can't just spray it over widespread areas. That essentially it was too indiscriminate a tool, right? In that sense, the fact too that many of these compounds, and it wasn't just DDT, there were a whole range of other compounds that other scientists were starting to find were remaining in the environment and traveling throughout the food chain, having all kinds of deleterious effects. So you mean to kill bugs, but it gets into birds, it gets into mammals, again, eventually into humans, right? And also, she was also, and others were also aware that they were going to create a kind of a superbug in that regard. And we think about this in terms of the overuse of penicillins and antibacterial things in the creation of these kind of super germs. Well, the same thing was going to happen, she predicted, with things like the use of DDT, that eventually the mosquitoes would develop, because they can rapidly breed, that they would develop a resistance to it. And she was certainly she was right. But I think the most important thing that came out of this was that it was the way in which the book questioned this kind of uncritical faith in modern science to bring progress, right? That human beings were playing with things that they didn't really understand, and that they needed to be far, far more careful. Now, some of this is also, you may want to look at, may have had long-term implications for good and for bad into things like the anti-vax movement and climate change and others. And it also, in many ways, the ways in which the chemical industry responded to this book often is seen as the textbook case on how to respond to things like climate change. Again, we think about the resistance of the tobacco companies to the claims that their products cause cancer. Became kind of a textbook case on how you present a counter argument to these claims. Okay. Again, 1960s. Again, we want to think about this. Kind of if we were thinking about pictures, and again, last week we looked at the 50 greatest inventions and all those other things. Photography appears on the list, right? Well, the picture that kind of launches the modern environmental movement is something known as the Earthrise photograph. And I think I may have showed this earlier in the course, right? This idea that, we're kind of alone in the universe, but it spawns a kind of whole almost cultural revolution, right? Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth Catalog, which is this catalog that comes out of California, which really promotes kind of low tech, kind of what was known as appropriate technology, or the back to the land movement that becomes popular among a counterculture. But also these notions about going off grid that really start in this period. By 1970, we have the first Earth Day, and as you can see here, in many ways, some of the themes are being repeated here, right? A young woman, a young girl here, right, basically saying, "Let me grow up," and we hear the same things from Greta Thunberg. There you go, that's her name. Similar to today, in which young people, I think, are far more concerned about the environment because it's the world that they are going to inherit. But as you can see here, a lot of this stuff is also about kind of pollution. And the irony here in many ways is that by the 1970s, pollution, particularly urban pollution, was actually starting to get a little bit better, but it was being driven by a number of events. There was a huge oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara, California. The Cuyahoga River outside of Cincinnati caught fire. There were all kinds of worries about leaded gasoline and the ways in which it was having an impact on Americans' health. There was obviously the smog that covered places like Los Angeles. And the first time I visited my uncle in LA, it took like 3 or 4 days before I realized that there were a huge, beautiful mountain range that you could see from his house, but couldn't see it through the smog for the first few days. But even elsewhere, the killer fog that killed hundreds of Londoners in 1952 because of the burning of coal. Glaswegians in this period, some have claimed, inhaled as many as 2 pounds of soot every year into their lungs because of the use of coal and other particulates in the environment. But some of this was actually starting to be cleaned up, in large part, again, because of the work of that people like Rachel Carson and others had stimulated in the first, with things like Silent Spring, and eventually into the 1980s with movements to eradicate acid rain, to put scrubbers on the tops of smokestacks, to put catalytic converters on cars to be able to reduce pollution. And in fact, so in many ways, urban pollution, or certainly air pollution, and even water pollution over the last between about 1940 and about 1960, 1970 was actually getting better, in large part because of the shift from fossil fuels, from more dirty technology, which was coal, to things like hydroelectricity, oil, refined oil, and natural gas. So there's kind of this, again, these kind of different ways to deal with pollution. But certainly it was the kind of prime motivating element. Now, there were other elements to this. Canada's contribution will be Greenpeace, which is, again, one of the world's largest and most sort of active environmental organizations, and it forms in 1971, as you can see here, kind of as an amalgam of many different kinds of movements. Certainly the environmental movement and the preservationist movement. There's elements of the Sierra Club, which come north into Canada off the west coast. But also the anti-war movement, because one of its first voyages was to protest the American testing of nuclear devices off the coast of Alaska, that they believed might create a huge tsunami wave that would endanger coastal communities. But also, again, this kind of countercultural kind of ethic, right? In that sense as well, and formed in Vancouver in 1971, and has gone on to become a global institution and organization. Others, again, if we're also going to try and think about Canadians' involvement, the 1972 Stockholm Conference really introduced this idea of in the environment into development and into, what we might call sort of third world development or international development. That again, we needed to think about the environmental effects of what we were doing when we were promoting development, when we were promoting, green revolution technology and all kinds of other things. Did it make sense to have super strains of rice if you had to then destroy thousands of acres or hectares of area to build a dam that would be able to then irrigate it and produce electricity that could produce the fertilizer that was necessary to grow it. So all of these things again became kind of interlinked. Again, going back to what we talked about sort of in the first few weeks, these ideas of limits to growth, that in the early 1970s, these kind of dire predictions, right, of the future, that computers had kind of run simulations and said, we don't really have too many resources left, and we can't keep pumping the kind of after effects of industrialization into the atmosphere. But also in many ways as well, in 1972, a huge wave of legislation that starts to emerge in the US, but other nations, to provide for things like clean water, to end the use of DDT spraying and all those other kinds of things. So again, these long effects that occur coming out of that early environmental movement. And I'm going to kind of end off here. I think we've gone far enough. We're just a little bit over an hour here, because in some ways, although the environmental movement and environmental issues, right, continue to develop over this period, really by the time we get to the late 1980s with the Brundtland Report, with this notion of our common future, the key issue becomes sustainable development, right? This idea that we need to have development today, right? Because we need this idea that the meshing between the economy and the environment, right? Which one do we put first? Can we afford to put one or the other first, or do they have to kind of always go together? And certainly the Brundtland Report in 1987, which lays the groundwork for the Earth Summit in 1992, for the Rio Declaration, for the Kyoto Protocol, and then eventually on to COP26, really lays that groundwork, right? In that regard, that basically says that, we cannot treat one issue in isolation of the other. This idea that this ecosphere, this ecosystem, the ecology of the Earth is all tied together, and we can't sort of, like Rachel Carson noted, right, go after one problem and think that essentially we have a magic bullet, and that won't have any other kind of deleterious effects, kind of downstream. So it's one of the first real movements and real reports to kind of try and reconcile the economy and the environment. But it has also left questions ever since, particularly among environmental activists, is there actually such a thing as sustainable development? Can we ever achieve that balance? And what might that balance look like? And certainly people have talked about elements of degrowth, keeping fossil fuels in the ground, all of these other kinds of things. How do we make that transition from a fossil fuel economy to one with more renewable, less polluting, less CO2 producing alternatives? And so it's really been the dilemma, I think, since the late 1980s. And again, much of the knowledge that we have about things like global warming or climate change, or the acidification of oceans, the salinization of soils, the great plastic islands that exist in the Pacific, much of this was known by the late 1980s, early 1990s. And some have even claimed that, some of the oil companies in that knew much, much longer before that, right? That their plastics didn't break down, that oil was, the burning of fossil fuels was contributing to higher and higher levels of CO2 in our atmosphere. So I think those are the kind of issues that we can get into in our discussions in our Wednesday group. As what do we mean by sustainable development, and what lessons of history from both the interplay between humans and their environments might give us, but also potentially what lessons the environmental movement can teach us about over the years about how we might best move forward, and how we might best convince the unconvinced that this is something that we need to do for the future, for our future, for the future of the planet, and for the future, basically, of all living things on Earth. So we'll leave it there. See you in the Wednesday classes. Thank you.